Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, episode 198.
Oh, I disagree.
Okay, good. Let's talk about it.
Wireless LAN Professionals is a place to educate, inform, encourage, and entertain those involved in wireless LANs. This Wireless LAN Professionals podcast is an audio manifestation of these goals. Our host is a wireless LAN veteran, consultant, designer, and teacher, Keith Parsons. And now, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals.
Welcome back to Wireless LAN Professionals podcast. My name is Keith Parsons, and today I'm with Samuel Clements. We'll be doing another episode of Wireless LAN Design Rules.
And when to break them.
First rule up, I say you should always do a validation survey. Now, here's the reason why. If you don't do a validation survey, you don't know where you have coverage and where you don't have coverage. So a lot of people go in and design their networks. They stick up a bunch of APs. They might have even done an IP in a stick in a couple of places and said, that's where my coverage is, and they walk away. What they don't know is what's the coverage actual post-install. When the APs are up, RRM's done its little channel planning, transmit power might be up or down, we don't know. And so if you always do a validation survey, you have one point in time where you have a baseline where you know where your coverage is, whether or not you have co-channel interference, whether or not you have adjacent channel interference, are the cells the size that you want them to be. So that's why I think the rule is always have a validation survey. Your take on that?
Yeah, I think that there's obviously a lot of wiggle room in there, especially as we talk about the lessons that we learned in the ECSE troubleshooting class, which there are a lot of different ways to look at a Wi-Fi network. You can look at a Wi-Fi network through the site survey report. You can look at it from a controller. You can look at it from packets. You can look at it from all over the place. And so if enough things line up ahead of time where you can say, for example, I know when I put this AP in this location, I use this transmit power. If you go back to the thing that you have access to, let's say, for example, you don't have access to the site post-deployment. We actually have situations right now where we've done deployments, and because of COVID-19 lockdown, we do not have physical access to the facility after the fact. So if you have a picture of the AP in the prescribed location, and it is where you told the installer to put the AP and it's oriented in the proper direction, and if you've logged into your infrastructure and you said, oh, look, this AP's radio is running at this power level, what's really the difference between the data that you have from an AP on a stick perspective versus the data that you would have during your post-installation validation?
One is if you didn't do 100% AP on sticks.
Yeah.
So that's an expensive option. You have some legitimate reasons where you've said in the past, if you do AP on sticks, it's a risk return thing. If the cost of returning on site to make a change is so high, it's worth the extra time to do a AP on a stick beforehand. Yeah. But there are a lot of people who don't have the budget to get away with the AP on a stick in 100% of locations. So they might do 10, 15, 20%, whatever they need to feel confident. And so at that point, you don't have that data. Yeah. Or the second is RRM didn't do what you told it to, or you have a picture where you thought it was installed, but they actually didn't put it in the right place, or they didn't connect up. Have you ever seen anyone put in the 2.4 antennas and the 5 gig ports?
Well, yes, way back in the day when we had single radiating element antennas, but today that's mostly a non-issue. And so I would say in the situation where for that particular concern, if you're using dual frequency antenna elements or if you're using integrated antenna APs, that tends to be less of a concern today. So if you've done an AP on a stick measurement of a location and it is an internal antenna AP, or you can reliably assume that the antenna elements are not going to be hooked up incorrectly, then that, of course, drives the dependency on an AP on a stick validation after the fact sort of to be a non-issue. I would say that RRM settling your network as you didn't expect it to settle is something that we can know, right? We can go and we can log into an NMS platform or a controller or the cloud or whomever is running your RRM algorithm, and we can ask that platform to say, what power level did you settle the AP at? And it's that checksum. If you did your AP on a stick at those locations and you had it set to 12.5 milliwatts and your RRM algorithm has settled it to 12.5 milliwatts, is there really a difference between that AP generating RF output plugged into your infrastructure or plugged into a battery hanging on a pole at the location that you expected it to go in. While that's not right for everybody, it is 100% risk versus reward. If you're going to mitigate that risk up front by doing an AP on a stick of all your locations, I think mitigates or at least lessens sort of the staunchness of the rule of always do a validation survey after the fact so you know what you've got. I guess I don't see a whole lot of difference between knowing what you've got before you install your AP or knowing what you've got after you've installed your AP, if you go and do your due diligence to make sure that the radios are configured correctly or have settled correctly, and you've got some pictures from the installers or whatever photographic evidence that you've got to make sure that the location is used as it was prescribed. If you are doing a predictive design only and then you're going and hanging your AP, or if you're doing these hybrid designs where you're doing one or two measured AP on a sticks and then you're feeding that data into a predictive model, I think that absolutely ramps up the requirement for doing a post-installation validation for critically important Wi-Fi networks. And of course, that disclaimer is, why would you put a network in if it wasn't critically important? Well, maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't, right?
Many people do.
Many people do, yeah.
That might be the requirement.
Well, and it might be. And I think that you can look to highly distributed enterprises. Let's pick on Starbucks. Do you think the VAR or the Starbucks employee that installed those APs went and did a validation survey of every single Starbucks location across the globe? No. And guess what? That network is considered a critically important Wi-Fi network. And I wouldn't go into an organization like Starbucks and say, look, you're doing 1 to 2 APs in every location. You must do a validation survey after the fact. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense.
This is supposed to be, a little back and forth, but I agree with you on a lot of those issues. But part of it also comes back to, is the AP on a stick survey that was completed? One, you have to do nearly 100% to support your statement.
Of course.
And then there are times when you do that. But also, for every single one of those APs, you have to walk not just the coverage area where you said, I want a neg 67.
You got to walk out to the cell boundary, yeah.
Which means every single one of those walks is a lot longer than most people do.
Yeah.
What I found, a lot of people do AP on the sticks, they go until the first cell edge of what they want, and then they stop.
Yeah.
Meaning you never collected co-channel interference data. And so when you show the report, it looks like it's not there when it actually is. Part of the reason I like the validation survey part, and though there's a cost, obviously there's a cost, I think the cost for a validation survey post-install is far cheaper than even if you go, even like say above 20% AP on a stick, it's still cheaper to do a validation survey than go the extra difference. Because you collect all the data at once, every AP cell edge all the way to the edge, and it's faster. And it's also easier to have all the data in one place.
Oh, I disagree.
Okay, good. Let's talk about it. So how is doing 100% AP on a sticks more efficient?
Yeah, I think you are making an assumption that an AP on a stick design is one AP at one time. I don't think there's any rule that says you can only do an AP on a stick for one AP at one time. If you go into a facility, then it's a 10 AP facility, you absolutely can stage 10 APs and you can do one walk pre-deployment, and you can gather all of that information with the exact same efficacy as you would and efficiency as you would doing a post-deployment validation. It's input on the front end versus time and energy and effort spent versus data received on the back end.
If you're going to make that kind of a statement and say, well, we put up 200 APs and did one walk, then I'll totally agree with you. Yeah. I just don't see most people doing APs on sticks.
Agreed. And because most people look at it from a pendulum perspective, they go, well, I'm not going to do 200 APs. My only choice is 200 APs or one AP. I disagree with that. I would say it's very common from an efficiency perspective to do more than one AP at a go. Obviously, there are some material impacts to pulling something like that off, right? You need the APs, you need batteries or switches or configs and blah. You can get far more efficient than doing one AP at a time. And I think the answer is, of course, generally somewhere in the middle. One AP tends to be on the efficient side, as you've said. But practically speaking, could you do 2, 3, 4 APs at a go? If that's something that you can do and you cut your overall effort into a quarter, maybe that's something where the payoff at the end is that built-in assurance, And maybe it's more effort, but maybe it's not 1,000% more effort.
From my own personal experience, one engineer with 4 APs and 4 sets of tripods is kind of the sweet spot. Mm-hmm, yeah. If you get more than that, you need more helpers to carry stuff around.
Sure.
If you have less than that, you're doing more walks, and the walk is the part that takes a long time because 4 APs cover, a huge chunk of area.
You have 4 classrooms.
You got me there, Sam. So for our answer of always do a validation survey, when would you not?
I wouldn't in a situation where the design is a chip shot, in the situation where you're covering less square footage with fewer than 3 APs than is reasonable. And the 3 AP boundary is obviously, non-overlapping channels, or you have enough confidence in your data, largely gathered through empirical measurements, that tells you with a high degree of confidence if your infrastructure has settled at a particular power level and at a particular channel. All these things are knowable, that it becomes largely unnecessary, or the assurance that you've received by doing that validation on the back end is largely unnecessary. Experience, right? Do them over and over and over again until you realize all that extra gathering of the data on the back end that you're doing actually looks a whole lot like your design up front, and really the data is unnecessary.
And I would use the exact same logic with you on the reverse. If I go in and I do 10% of the APs as AP on a stick to validate my design beforehand, before it's installed, then I can save 90% of those AP on a stick efforts and come back and do a single validation survey and get the whole thing documented at once.
Assuming you get them all right.
It's that risk return thing.
Absolutely.
If it absolutely has to be there, you've got to do every single one.
Yeah.
The other situation that I found where the validation survey is pretty much required is when you have scenarios that are highly changeable.
Yeah.
Highly reflective, where your predictive design doesn't really do a really good job because the environment has more reflections than it does absorption. Using Ekhouse software like I use today, it just doesn't have the reflection capability, so I have to do AP on a sticks at a very high level. But even after AP on a sticks, with say I take 4, you still have boundaries of your data sets.
Of course.
And I like to accomplish a validation survey in one pass. The other thing you'd mentioned earlier is about doing this remotely. One of the things I like to do is have my installers, when they're done, they're still on site, have them do a validation survey for me. I give them the tools, I have the map, I have the walking paths. All they have to do is walk and click. They don't have to think. And they can collect the data while they're still on site. And it's one single pass for them. It takes less than an hour. And I get the data to augment whatever we had in the AP on a stick that happened before.
It's rare that you find one person that owns wireless LAN lifecycle front to back, meaning one person has selected the product, they have done the predictive design, they have done the AP on a stick, they have done the cabling, they have done the validation, they have managed that AP through its life and then decommissioned it, right? It's rare that that's one person.
That's a one-man shop. And even some one-man shops don't do it. Yeah.
Terry Haviland, I think, does a large portion of that.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Including physically hanging the AP. If you have a high degree of confidence in the workforce that you're engaging and you can get good predictable labor, and this division of labor thing exists, and if you can trust all of those people to do the things that you need them to do, that's fantastic. It's negligible effort on the back end of a project, and you get a tremendous amount of rewarding data up front. With a limited walk path, of course, you have to be able to understand where that data is coming from and how it's gathered, and you have to be able to trust the source of truth. If you don't have somebody who understands what a walk path is or why they have to stop outside of a door and click and then open up the door and move through it, click before they move, and get to the other side of the door and click before they close the door, and then click before they start again, right? That nuance, I think, is lost on a lot of people. Of the millions of APs that get installed worldwide, I would wager that a fraction of a single-digit percentage of the installers who do them understand the nuance behind going and gathering that empirical measurement afterwards.
That's true. That's a really low number.
It is.
I think you have the same issue when you send out your teams to do the pre-install AP on a sticks. They have to have all those skills.
Yeah.
I think what we're saying is there's so many different people involved. If you can get them, and I've tried to train my installers, not just train them technically, but train them financially, that if you do this, you get paid more money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They want to do it correct. You can train train people to do that walk and click part fairly accurately if you give them all the tools. But that's just a little more effort to do on one side versus the other side.
Of course.
So to recap, I said, always do a validation survey. And Sam comes back and says,
only when you need to.
Okay. Sounds like a good answer.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Wireless LAN Pros for all the latest news and updates, and also connect directly with Keith on Twitter at Keith R. Parsons. Head over to www.wlanpros.com for this episode's show notes, as well as the latest in all things Wi-Fi.